Hello everyone, we're back with another episode of That's Creative. How does someone go about curating an exhibit? How do you find the right artist for your show? In this episode, we spoke to exhibition curator and Green politician Jarelle Francis about art, work, and politics. Enjoy!
Another episode of That's Creative. We're very pleased today to be joined by our friend Jarelle, who we work with on the pop-up painting team. Jarelle, thanks so much for coming to speak with us today.
Hello everyone.
Hello.
Thanks for inviting me.
That's all right. So Jarelle, for those of you who haven't met him, works at pop-up painting events as an events lead. But beyond that, you are a curator, an art curator, and a political activist.
Yeah.
I suppose a first question, as an art curator, what does that actually entail? It's something that I think people see the end product of, but probably don't know much about the process. So what is being an art curator like?
So, hi everyone, firstly. I kind of categorize it as the person who does everything to put on the art exhibition. And that includes all of the kind of boring admin-y stuff. It includes the concepts. My art curators work in different ways. I'm an independent curator, so I'm fortunate that I can do exhibitions that I want to do. So I tend to do things which I find interesting. So my first independent curation was an exhibition last January called Look Abstract, which was based on abstract artists, as in the name. And I used a painter, sculptor, digital photographer, and that was in North Kensington. And so that was my first exhibition because I love abstract art. So what I thought I would do is try and use different abstract artists as well, not just painters, because everyone normally sees abstract art as paint. But I used a digital photographer who does collages, and I thought she was very interesting, called Rachel Isabel. I had another person who was meant to show, but he didn't. He pulled out last minute. That's another problem curators have. You have to deal with artists who sometimes pull out for the last minute, or a piece of work that you wanted to use isn't available for whatever reason, and you've got to change the whole show around. But anyway, he was also a digital artist, but he used sculpting as well, which I thought was quite interesting. And I used Kate Dolan, who was a painter, who is one of my favorite painters. I have an actual painting of hers on my wall. I'll kind of turn it around quickly. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, lovely.
All right.
So it's sort of pinks and yellows and oranges.
Yes. So
how do you describe it?
What's that about?
She is an abstract expressionist artist called Kate Dolan. I just love her work, and I think she's going to be the next big thing. I met her working at Wimbledon Art Fair. So that's another thing I do. I freelance and I work at different art fairs. So I was managing a building at the Wimbledon Art Fair, and she was an artist there. And that's one thing that I do as a curator: go to a lot of art fairs, look at different types of artists, kind of look at what's happening within the art world, what people are liking and gravitating towards. And so I met her, and and this is another thing which happens often with my art exhibitions. I meet an artist and I get inspired by them, and then I decide that I'm going to create a show so I can use that artist. But I liked abstract art anyway, and I was thinking about doing an abstract show, and that just kind of was the spark for me. So yeah, that was Look Abstract, which was done last January. I did another show this time last year, actually, at the end of August, called Utopia, which was based on artists who use vivid colors within their works. And that was my first time also using an artist who does projections called Jake Andrew. He did a projection, and so it was like a sound and visual installation in the basement of this gallery downstairs. So you go downstairs and you'd hear the sound, and you'd walk in and your shadows would move with the kind of installation which was moving as well. So that was quite cool. I used another artist called Sally Gorham, who did a wonderful piece, which was, I think they were like 30 by 20 squares all at the back of the room, and it created this one massive piece as a collage. I used an artist called Liz West, who does wonderful, massive installations. She's done installations for Fortnum and Mason, but she also had this really small maquette that she did, which was a light maquette. That was great. And it was the first time that I used an international artist as well, in Sana Abreu. She was from Portugal. And that was also a learning curve to deal with an international artist, because I have to deal with all of the shipping costs, getting it sent over. It's not easy to get paintings sent over. It's not like just getting a DHL. Actually, I couldn't use any courier services because the paintings are so big. So they were like 200 by 200 and 1 meter, 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter. So I couldn't use any of those couriers because they were too big.
Oh.
So I had to use a kind of shipping courier and container, and they were very expensive, and I couldn't use. You can't use them at short notice. So I don't know how I managed to get them over actually in the end. I think she found someone in Portugal to take it. I couldn't find anyone in England in a short period of time to take it. So that's part of being a curator, is finding the artist, dealing with all the shipping, dealing with insurance as well. You have to have insurance just in case anything goes wrong. And a lot of artists won't work with you unless you have insurance. Finding the venues, that's quite a challenge, to find a venue which is reasonably priced, especially in London. Both shows were in central London, so I was very fortunate. I negotiated the price down a bit, but it still was quite costly.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to compromise on a space, because otherwise the show is just not going to be good. So I really take my time with finding a venue and a space with good access, somewhere where people generally come to central London. And yeah, just dealing with the artists from start to finish, starting with the concept, persuading the artist. And not all of the artists that you want to use necessarily will end up in the final show. And a lot of the time, I'm quite a new curator, they won't, my second show was fine, and because I'd already done one, but my first show was quite difficult to get artists to commit to me showing their work, and me handling their work, and me using their work, and because it's their work, which is understandable, and it's their kind of babies kind of thing. So I found that this year, which has been a crazy year, I had 3 exhibitions planned this year. All were cancelled because of what's happening. But I found this year it was easier to get artists to work with me because I'd already done 2 previous exhibitions. And so you could send them messages, and they were happier to work with me this year. So I think going forward, it's going to be a bit easier for me to get artists on board, but it's still quite a challenge as an emerging curator. And it's also going to be a challenge financially as well, just because I haven't worked obviously this much this year, and I'm paying for it through with my own money, so it's quite difficult to find spaces which are reasonably priced as well.
Yeah, I bet.
Do you take commission, Jarelle, from the artists? I mean, how would you make your money back if it's all self-funded? Oh, I didn't hear that.
So the idea is to take commission. Oh, sorry, have I broken up?
A little bit, that's okay.
I'm back now.
I'm back in the room. 1, 2, 3, I'm back in the room. So the idea is, when you are a curator, that you take commission from any pieces of work sold. Some curators charge, the bigger curators charge artists. Some charge artists to show in their shows because they're such big curators and they have such a client base that they can afford to, that artists, it's beneficial for them to be in their shows. Whereas I'm an emerging curator, so I don't charge artists to show, but I will take anywhere from 20 to 40% commission, depending on the exhibition, and depending on the work. But that's basically negotiated before, and all the artists will have the same commission rate. So it's fair to them.
Right, that's really.
And so in an ideal world.
Oh no, I was gonna say, like, so as an so because you're an emerging curator, like, how do you sell for artists to, how do you persuade an artist to come on board with you without, or maybe you do have a client base?
It's
Yeah.
just
How do you go
the
about
gift of the
having that?
gab.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
it's more
A
like
bit of a Del boy.
yeah. I think it's more about the exhibition and what I'm trying to do as a curator. And so, as I've said, with the first two that I've done, it's been a lot easier this year speaking to artists about showing their work with me. And going forward, I can also tell artists what I'm planning to do going forward as well. So they kind of get an idea for the kind of things that I have done, that I'm going to do on this exhibition, and I'm doing going forward. And many artists do kind of like the idea and concepts of things that I'm coming up with. So they'll say, "Oh, that sounds great." Liz West is quite an established artist who showed with me last year, and she said that she thought it was great of me as an emerging curator to ask such an artist to be in their show, because it showed kind of that I had an ambition,
Yeah.
which is what she wanted to see, and she did say that many emerging curators just wouldn't have asked in the first instance. And so it showed that I had an ambition, and that's kind of what I'm aiming for as well. I go for top artists. I kind of am punching above my weight in what I want to do, because that's kind of where I want to end up. So I don't see any reason why I should settle for the kind of caliber of artists that I choose. And I think both exhibitions have been well received. I got good reviews from the London Art Critic, who came to one of them, and yeah, and going forward, I'm really excited about what's happening with the current exhibitions that I'm planning at the moment.
Yeah, just before we ask you about what you've got coming up, I think it's really interesting that you've ended up in the field of being an art curator.
Yeah.
Was it something that like you always wanted to do, or like how did you or did you stumble into it? How did you decide? Well, I'm going to be an art curator. How did you? Have you always loved art in that way? Like how did you get there?
Well, it's interesting. I never always wanted to be a curator, and I never really considered art in a career frame of mind at all. When I was young, I always wanted to work in fashion and clothing. So I did do that, and I've worked in buying for a number of years. And then I had my own vintage clothing shop for a year just off Brick Lane. And then after that, I went back into head office work for clothing, and I kind of fell out of love with it just because I had my own shop and then had to go back into head office work. And I used to go to galleries quite a lot. I was working at John Lewis head office at a point, and it was one stop away from Sloane Square, which is where the Saatchi Gallery was. And I used to go there on my lunch break. So I used to go on my lunch break and just sit and walk around. And I realized that I didn't want to work in fashion anymore, but I really didn't know what else I wanted to do, because I'd always wanted to work in fashion for my whole life. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I was walking around galleries, and I really loved art exhibitions. And I started to go into more galleries and more exhibitions, and started looking at things which were hanging. And I wonder how they got this here, and I wonder how they convinced the artists. So then I did a short course. It's like an 8-week course at City Lit, an art curation course. And I had this really interesting lecturer, and we used to go to galleries and discuss curation and how it works. And we used to discuss what was good or what was bad about an exhibition. And then after that, I decided, yeah, this is what I kind of wanted to do. But I didn't study art. I studied business entrepreneurship. So it's completely different from anything that I've ever studied. So I then started to work in galleries as a gallery assistant, and work at art fairs, and work with pop-up painting.
Yeah.
And it was I realized that I wanted to work within art, and then I started to work with some curators, like assisting them, and then I said I thought I could do it by myself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose so maybe there isn't a parallel here, but I think one of the things that works about pop-up painting is that the people leading it don't come from an art background, so we're much more like our customer. And I suppose for you to not be a painter yourself, do you think that gives you an advantage? Do you think it's a useful perspective to have, or actually is that what it's like anyway?
No, I think there are a lot of curators who are artists. There are a lot of artist curators, and actually some of the artists that I have used themselves are curators and put on exhibitions. I think people from different backgrounds in any field which is not which they studied is interesting, because you don't necessarily have the kind of, you're not preoccupied with what's meant to be kind of things. So I'm still learning about art, and how it works, and I'm always discovering new artists, which is great and fascinating to me. Whereas many artists are kind of, they went through art school and they're kind of, they're not bored necessarily, but they've done that throughout their whole life. And so I think I've brought a different perspective to things, in kind of like a business sense, and how things can be done as well. And I've also shown artists, when I've done a couple shows, the artists have said to me, "Oh, you know what? We wasn't convinced with when I saw this other artist's work with how it would work with mine, but actually it looks really good, and we would never have shown it that way." So I don't know. I think subconsciously I'm looking at things completely different to people who have been immersed in art all their lives.
What would you title an exhibition if all the artwork was made by guests of pop art painting?
That's a good one. On the spot. Pop-up artists.
Oh, that's a good one. So tell us a little bit about the exhibition that you've got coming up this week. So for when we are right now, for anyone listening later in time, this is the 2nd of September, 1st of September. So what have you got coming up this week?
So from the 4th of September, which is Friday, until Monday, I've got a series of Black Lives Matter installations going up in and around London. And the first installation is at 48 Poland Street in Soho. It's a shop window, and it's owned by, I'm currently doing a curatorial residency at this place called Koppel Project, which is like a creative community of different type of artists, dancers, theatre groups, photographers, filmmakers, painters, sculptors, digital artists, the whole lot. And it's a really good community, but they've got this space until the end of this month, actually. So I'm curating a show which is comprised of, I think, 13 photographers who went to the Black Lives Matter marches across the whole of UK. So I've got photographs from London, Leeds, Bedford, Bradford, Brighton, all across the UK. And I've made a 6-minute moving image piece, which is those photographers and some kind of shots which capture the zeitgeist, I feel. So there's like a shot of the Bristol statue coming down. John Boyega, who's an actor, did a speech. There's a shot of that as well. So what I'll be doing is projecting that, and there'll be 2 spoken word artists, Pat Leacock and Valencia Rose, and their pieces will be shown either side of that moving image piece. So it's going to be like a loop of like 13 to 15 minutes. And so that will be projected 24 hours a day from the Friday until the Monday. And there will be 4 sound installations which is just me hooking it up to a speaker outside. So there will be, the first one will be at 4 p.m. on the Friday, then on the hour every hour till 8 p.m. So 4 p.m., 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 and 8 will be the last one. And on Saturday, I was thinking about doing sound installations from like midday till 6 p.m.
Okay.
But earlier you said you was going to come at 11.
I mean, I can come at 1 p.m. That's
you have to go later.
I can come at 1 p.m. That's fine. I'll come at 1.
Earlier. You might make me wake up earlier in the day. I was thinking most people probably come around midday, but since you're an early bird, Gareth, I might
I'm really not an early bird.
I might consider an 11 p.m. till 6 p.m. But I will put out the full list later today. So I'm doing that later today. Okay. And then on Sunday, again, it will be something like midday till 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. will be the sound installation.
Mm.
And then I'll put those, I'm creating a website which I'll put them on after the exhibition as well. So the series of Black Lives Matter installations was mainly supposed to be in Haringey, where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
They were supposed to go up in and around Haringey, but I managed to get this space, fortunately, and it's a great space in Soho. It will be a good chance for a lot of the photographers to show in a space which they've never been shown before. Across the installations, I'm trying to use a lot of artists who are Black and women and working class backgrounds. And I specifically put out a call for artists who consider themselves disabled as well, to try and show people who don't normally get shown in the art world. And that's one of my aims as a curator, actually, going forward, to really have my exhibitions featuring a lot of women, people from minorities, and people who have disabilities as well. Because I don't think when you go to the Tate or wherever, watch other galleries, they don't have that much representation, which is quite bad. And so that's what I want to kind of push as well, that we show people who are not always shown.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the figures, I don't know if there is an equivalent figure for race, but the National Gallery, of their collection of like 23,000 pieces of art, I think 11 are by women, or you know, less than 20 are by women. I don't have the same. And I think this is one of the things that's happened recently over the last 5 years when it comes to gender, where actually there's been a lot of like plugging the data gaps.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of anything. I don't think no one's counted how many Black artists are in the National Gallery.
No, I don't know. I mean, there might be. I haven't. I've heard that stat, by the way, before about the National Gallery. I haven't heard any about race or anything else. But I think even without the stats, it's quite obvious when you go into any of the galleries, especially in London, that they're not really representative of the community as a whole, or the art community as a whole, and that's problematic. And for some of the art fairs that I've been to, the major art fairs as well, that many of the galleries don't seem to be showing many artists of a diverse nature as well. So that's quite a problem within the art world. And so I've got more installations coming up, but the dates have not been confirmed yet. But I'm working as well with Alexandra Palace, which is really exciting. About doing something there, but they're not sure when they're opening up again yet. So they're going to be staggered installations, and the idea was to mainly have them in October, which is Black History Month. So this will be the first one, and then coming up there'll be more, and then in October there'll be quite a lot, and they'll be staggered throughout till the end of the year. And they're all site specific, which is quite exciting and nerve-wracking as well. So I've got kind of the photographs that I want to be used, but they have to be displayed in different ways in different sites. I've got a site in Wood Green Shopping Mall, which I'll be decking out, putting tints represent, yeah. That's where I'm from now. That's where I'm Wood Green.
North London,
that's where we have the sun. So
visited Wood Green loads of times.
Well, you can visit again when the installation's up.
Will. That's exciting.
It's going to be, it's exciting, but I'm also waiting for Arts Council funding and hoping that they give me funding. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go down a different route. So this exhibition I put on myself with my own money, and because it's not that expensive to actually do. But the other sites, I've got quotes for like decking out the windows and everything, and it's running into the thousands of pounds. So it's not something I can really afford to do. The council are supporting me in putting that on, but with morale, not financially. So it's going to be interesting. But yeah, I'm really excited about these exhibitions coming up, because I think it's obviously because of the riots that's been happening in America, because of the protests which have happened here. I think it's important to highlight. I've always in the back of my head, I've thought about doing an exhibition on kind of Black history or something else. And it seemed like a good time to do it now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I suppose on that point, you know, obviously this has been a busy year, and you know, race relations and COVID and the intersectionality around all of that has been on the agenda in a way that I suppose most people won't remember ever being talked about in that way.
Yeah.
What is your sense though, and you know, you're approaching this, you know, from a political lens as well. Do you think that actually anything substantial has changed? Like, do you think that the black squares on Instagram have changed history?
In a short answer, no.
No.
I think what it's done is open up the idea to talk to major organisations about discrimination and representing people and their workforce means. I think I'm in a group collective. I'm not sure what's happening with it, but which sought to go on Instagram or Twitter and look at all the companies who did post black squares and then start holding them to account to make sure that they have people, that their workforce is representative, to make sure that we highlight anything the company may have done historically, which can be considered racist, and what they do need to do to change that. So I think opening up that conversation has happened. I think we need real systemic change, and that means coming from the government. And I don't see that happening at this moment in time, unfortunately, especially with this kind of government. So we still have quite a long way to go. And I think it's important that we continue the message throughout the year. So even though the exhibitions that I'm installing are around Black History Month, ideally I would like to work with all of the people that I work with in these installations to maybe create a space or create an idea that we can continue working throughout the year and put on more exhibitions throughout the year. One of the things we want to do for the Alexandra Palace one is to create a set of program and talks, of course, depending if it's COVID safe. So now that children are back to schools, they always work with schools anyway. So we're thinking about bringing in speakers, anti-racism speakers for age-appropriate classes, talking about inviting people like politicians or people locally to come to the event to ensure that they're seen at the event as well. It's important to keep the conversation going and make sure that it doesn't just fade into the oblivion like other movements have done in the past.
Yeah. I suppose one of the things that you said there was interesting. I think it relates to, you know, so you're also a Green Party activist, and what you talked about, you know, changing attitudes around race was that it was systemic and it would rely on big actors and government rather than you know, rely on individual stuff. And I suppose that to me sounds a lot like what we hear about, you know, environmentalism in 2020 and beyond, that actually individuals changing their behaviour almost is a good start, but it's not sufficient in any way. So do you see those things as interplaying, like, or like, what is your thinking around that?
I think the concept of individual responsibility was created to take away the responsibility of governments and major conglomerates for what they're doing. If you just take the pandemic as an example, we accidentally kind of had to ground planes. You stopped buying nonsense from halfway across the world, and CO2 levels did drop, but still not significantly enough in order to combat climate change, which means that we need systemic changes from the top down. And I think shirking responsibility, which government has done a lot of the time, is not going to get us to that situation. Now, individuals can make changes, like with the marches and the protests, and they can draw the change. But what we're asking for is government change. That's what the protests are about. is for governments to acknowledge that there is a problem with systemic racism, there is a problem with climate change, and that they have to do something about it in order to change it for the individuals who protest. So there's no point all of the protests happening if nothing does change. And I just think it's still kind of slow. We're still slow to change, and I think governments are still slow to change. So we still have, individually, we still have to keep the pressure up, and that's our job as individuals, but we can't physically, it's impossible for one person to change systems. It has to be
Why
government.
doesn't government listen? If all these facts and figures are out there and it's clearly that there is issues, why are they not thinking about it in a serious way as everybody else? Why do they not care?
Maybe you should get Boris Johnson on to ask him. that would be an
What do
interesting
you
one.
guys think?
I think especially with this government, I haven't known such an irresponsible, inept, immoral, incompetent government ever. And I just watched PMQs before I came on here. I don't know if you got a chance to see it. I mean, it's probably the worst PMQs performance I've ever seen of a prime minister ever. And I think there isn't a need for government to change with especially our voting system. So if you look at countries in Europe who have different voting systems, they have proportional representation, which is one thing I'm really, really pushing. If we had proportional representation, you have more accountability for politicians in positions of power. With the first past the post system and the way our parliament works, and Boris Johnson's 80-seat majority, it's almost kind of de facto like a dictatorship. I can do what I want and I can do what I please. And it doesn't matter how much we protest. And this is why we kind of have to also push our local MPs to change that situation. We're the only country, I think, in Europe with first past the post, apart from Belarus. And what's happening at Belarus at the moment? They're protesting against their prime minister because of a dodgy election. And if you look at America's voting system, it's even worse than our voting system, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by over 2 million votes in the last election and wasn't the president. So both countries are kind of imploding because people feel that the systems do not work for them, and that's what systemic change is about. And if the systems did change and did work for them, then I don't think there would be as much protest, because you would be able to vote knowing that you've got a voice in parliament, and you'd be able to hold people in positions of power to account. But until we get that, we're still going to have to protest and still going to have to bang at the door, proverbially speaking. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Banging at number 10. But yeah, so it's, I mean, and I think with the pandemic, it's also highlighted what many have thought about inequality. It's disproportionately hit people on low incomes, disproportionately hit people of color, because they tend to be in lower income areas, disproportionately hit people who live in areas with higher pollution rates, the respiratory problem as well. So all of these things are intertwined and interlinked. They're not coincidental. And you kind of, there's a lot of people in politics as a whole, and this is Green Party as well, where they're single-minded. Like there's people in the Green Party who are just about the environment, which is fine. But you can't have, to me, you can't have kind of ecological justice without social justice, and they're completely interlinked with each other.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that. So one of the things that I've been trying to reflect on recently is what is the overall idea of what I do. And actually I suppose that's probably a good question for you as well. So from the way I think about my life, it's all sort of in a general liberal direction. Unleashing creativity is a liberal message. It's sort of even if, you know, internally it has a logic to me. So I
Yeah.
suppose for you, does your curation and your politics and everything else you do, does it have like an overarching narrative? And I think that's really interesting for people who are doing like portfolio work and like jumping between things. Like, how
Yeah.
do you think about yourself and what you do? What do you think on that?
I think I want to make. I sometimes I have like a conflict with kind of politics and work. I do sometimes try to keep them separate, but
Mm.
they automatically end up intertwined just because of how I think subconsciously.
Mm.
But when I do my art exhibitions, my number one thing I think is that they are good,
Mm.
that they're visually exciting because they're visual exhibitions, and then if I can link other things as well, I will do so. So I have actually, even though I'm doing the Black Lives Matter installations now, I have actually been asking the council to work with them to set up like a school art competition in Haringey, and it hasn't kind of come to fruition, and I've tried to do that, and I've kind of hit stumbling blocks along the way. And I really want to kind of do that next year, look about doing that, creating some sort of annual art competition which is aimed at lower income kids to do art. And I think art and creativity is actually, and the lack of it in some spaces is one of the reasons which drives crime and drives kind of mental health approaches. Because I think one of the first things that government conservatives did when they come in was cut like art classes and stuff as, oh, it's not a real subject. Actually, I think it's one of the most important subjects and creativity. And I think near enough within everything, there has been someone creative at some point. So, you know, even the people who work in the city and they sell stocks and shares, there would have been someone who came up with an idea to create a company. There would have someone who come up with an idea for a logo for that company. There would have been, you know, everything which is sold is a creative, it started with a creative kind of idea of some sort. And so I really don't get this art's not a real subject thing, which has come in, and art schools being cut, art funding being cut, teachers being cut. And then if you are a creative person and you don't kind of learn like a battery chicken hen, which is what they kind of teach us like in the UK, you know, learn your exams this way. You have to do exams this way. You have to read books in a certain way. You have to write in a formulaic way. If your brain is, if you're creative or if you're neurodiverse and you cannot learn like that, then you're automatically precluded from a better education. Your learning isn't as good as other people's, and that leads to exclusions from classes. And then if you're excluded from school, you could end up getting into the wrong crowd. And I think all of these are interlinked with each other. So my whole thing was, if we could set up like an arts competition which is aimed at lower income. And another thing is that if, for instance, you want to be a painter and you're from a low income background, you know, you're barely surviving, so you can't afford to buy what is luxury in paints. You can't afford to buy a paper or a canvas. You can't. You might not have any space. You might share. You might live in a 1-bed house or 2-bed house and have several siblings, and you've got no space to be creative or no outdoor space. So, yeah, one of the things I want to do is create an art competition, because I think actually if we focus more on the arts, I think people would have something to do. And a lot of people in Tottenham are very creative musically. We have a lot of musicians from Tottenham. There's just a lack of quite a lot, and I've spoke to quite a few different groups in Haringey, and there isn't a specialist art school or anything in Haringey. So that's one thing I really want to kind of pursue doing, because I think they're all intertwined. And I think if we can get arts back on the curriculum and get people using their brain in a different way, then they'll be much more fulfilled within their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really compelling argument for giving the arts more prominence in people's well-being and education. And I suppose on that note, to bring us to a close, if people want to find out more about your work and your exhibitions, where should they be looking to stay up to date?
Well, on my Instagram is a good place to go. It's Jarelle Francis, and that will have my upcoming exhibitions, what I've already done. And yeah, you can contact me on there. My DMs are open.
Well, Jarelle, thank you very much. And we look forward to coming to your exhibition this weekend.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me.